So throughout quarantine, maybe even today, each of us have, throughout this season, engaged in some guilty Netflix pleasures. I know I'm not the only one because I asked around, okay? I know mine was The Crown and The Queen's Gambit, among a few. I asked Lori, and she had an eclectic mix of Dr. Pimple Popper and Hoarders and Swamp People. I didn't get a chance to ask Ken this morning, but what I know of his culinary skills, perhaps he might have taken a little dip into the Great British Baking Show. Whatever it is, there are all sorts of ways that we have found a little pressure release just to look at something that may seem mindless or an experience that brings us out of reality. As I talk to a lot of my guy friends, they are obsessed with this show on the History Channel called Forged in the Fire. Now you can hear the grunting and feel the testosterone probably just coming from the screen. I checked it out for a minute just to see what it was about, partly because I thought it might have some kind of connection to this series that I felt, as your pastor, God calling us to move through as it relates to resilience. And this Forged in the Fire show really just shows a centuries-old craft in real time of people today making instruments out of steel and different metals and testing them to see if they will actually hold their weight, if they will stay strong in the midst of brute force or all sorts of different conflicts and troubles that would come their way. As we have entered into this year, 2021, so many of us have been tested in that same way. We have been tools of God to be used in various ways, and we have encountered barrier after barrier. If I have talked to one of you, I've talked to so many that have said some version of this phrase. Well, we came out of last year really bent, but not broken. Bent, but not broken. And I do think that is a starting place of understanding what resilience may mean. The temptation for a lot of us is to speak of resilience as if someone is strong and tough no matter what. We think of all sorts of people, whether they be Rosa Parks or John McKay or so many other people that have gone through considerable trials. But that rigidity of thinking you're either strong and tough or you're not doesn't quite cut it when we talk about the complex reality and process toward building resilience in the human life. In fact, it's not just about being stronger or tougher than your circumstances, but instead becoming stronger and more flexible, more adaptable. It's about becoming tempered. And Todd Bolsinger, who was a pastor in a former time and now does a lot of speaking engagements, and it's connected to a seminary doing some leadership work there, he wrote a book called Tempered Resilience that I moved through and just really felt like it resonated to some of the things we needed to contend with in our own lives as people of faith. And the whole premise of his book was really launched from having an experience at a place called Adams Forge, which is in North California somewhere. He and his wife went to just get away and have a different kind of creative experience for a time. And he had all sorts of urban dwellers around him that, actually put their cell phones in their cars, and they were focused on something that was creative, in fact, primitive. It really got you out of your own ruts to learn the art of transforming something, rods of steel into tools that can be used. And he talks about the fact that once this raw material becomes under the hammer of the smith and the heat of the forge, once it becomes a new creation that has a new purpose, it also loses nothing of its original makeup. And through that age-old process that was made in a far previous century, maybe we can find a glimpse of what we must have happen in our lives if we are to thrive in this moment, too, to be made into that which we were meant for. You know, Todd talked about the fact that the smith that was really putting the whole experience together and helping them learn what to do, he gave a safety lecture that said, be careful. These instruments that you have may look really cool right now as in temperature, but it's 700 degrees, and if you touch any part of it, it can burn off the skin of your hands like that. When a piece of steel looks like it's coming out of the forge, and when it's cool like that, it's not ready for shaping. Any kind of hitting it, any kind of force that it experiences, it will only mar it, mangle it, and scar its surface. Because it doesn't look any different, in fact, it can actually be more dangerous to deal with it, Paul said. And so if we're going to make steel into something that can be used, the smith continued to kind of help them move more toward the forge and get up a little bit of courage. He said it needs to be much, much hotter, nearly 2,000 degrees. There, and only there, will it be soft and malleable enough to take the shaping. And that requires a lot more heat, so stick it on in. I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like that raw material that's been stuck into the furnace, and I never got asked whether it was okay. I don't think anybody else knows what I'm talking about. I see some nods here. It's a part of life. It's a part of being human. The actual task of living this life we share together is really the shop and the forge that makes us ready for the next step of becoming more flexible when we have been taught through all sorts of different forces and influences in life to be as rigid and as focused as possible. It gets us ready in some ways to not just be more flexible, but in our terms, what we're really talking about is being more vulnerable, even self-reflective, self-aware, in the things that happen in our lives. So if we take the metaphor to its fullest degree, we think about all of us that know something of the heat that comes from just living life and experiencing failures and hardships and unexpected battles in relationships and otherwise. And if we are all tempered steel that can be perfectly balanced between that midpoint of being so soft that we just fall apart and so hard and brittle that we become completely damaged at the first sign of stress. We want to find that sweet spot where resilience lives. And to temper describes that whole process, not only of heating, but of holding and cooling and hammering and reheating the material. So it adds productive stress until it becomes something greater than it was before, something greater than the sum of its parts. But stress has to be present. There's no way around it. Heat in the forge and in the forge of life is in fact necessary. It has to be added to make the steel stronger. So in our text today from the book of Numbers, it's not one that we read very often in churches. It doesn't come up in the lectionary but once every 3 years. And I know I often read it in a very serious tone, focusing on the rabble and how just tethered we are to the past or to our own expectations that can, in fact, be almost always our tripping points. But today, I almost find a little bit of humor, maybe because you have to. Sometimes you have to choose to laugh, otherwise you'll cry. But there is some humor in this if we really focus on what Moses is dealing with. And there was a pastor that kind of put it in a different frame that I wanted to share with you because, man, it speaks to my life right now. The people were seeing themselves in very static terms and telling him all of the things that they wanted. And all of a sudden, as Moses is bringing them on this second leg of the journey, there are different parts going from Egypt to Sinai and then Sinai into Moab and the huge wilderness journey that they were to run over 40 years at the invitation of God. Moses, at this moment, he chooses to slam his letter of resignation down on the proverbial dashboard of this huge station wagon filled with feral children, right? He finds himself basically saying, God, I give up. God, you didn't call me to feed these people. These aren't my progeny. They aren't my flesh and blood. All of these things that they're saying, all the complaints that they're making, there's nothing I can do. I don't know what you expect from me at this point, right? Perhaps he came to the end of his pastoral, even parental responsibility, as I know some of us do at times, when he had to just pull over the car and basically be honest with God about, in fact, his frustrations that are founded in fear. If you think about it, Moses is in a long line of leaders, just regular, ordinary people that happen to be given an extraordinary purpose for a time, just like us. Moses and Elijah and Jonah and Jeremiah, all of them in one way or another gave this cry to God when they came to the end of their rope. Moses is spent, he's dried up, he's running on fumes, and in today's world, we would call that heating in his life burnout. Just straight up burnout, coming to the edge of his strength into something else. So he brings to God his own death wish in a few choice words and says, with all earnestness, I cannot carry this by myself. The load is too heavy for me. Sometimes you and I all have callings that are way too heavy in life. Maybe it's hard to even hold the material you've been given because it's starting to get heated too much and there's nothing to protect you from the heat you fear will come. How many of us right now, if we are really honest with ourselves in the quietness of our hearts, how many of us right now, with whatever load or multiple loads we are holding, would just drop it and walk away if you could? How many of us are at that point of our end, our point where there seems like there is no return, being tempted to just head back even to the brittle or broken existence that you once had, that even once bound you, because at least it's better to deal with the familiar than this new thing? But it is remarkable because, as Sarah Groves puts it, the burden God gives us is often too heavy to carry, but impossible to leave. Because in these moments of heat, when we actually stay in place, no matter what comes, we often discover, like Moses eventually did, that these are the places of closest proximity, of most intimate encounter with God. It is where we find the heart of God. It's at the place where our strength ends and God's always begins, but we realize that God's strength was there all the time, giving us maybe not always what we wanted, but exactly what we needed. It's even our breakdown in the burnout where we feel like we are going to fall apart, where God begins to emerge, the breakthrough coming. This whole journey out there centuries ago and the journey here now is always a potential lesson in resilience for our best life. I love biographies. might be a nerdy thing to some, but I really love reading about people's lives from all of the sources that people can pull together, because they reveal deeper truths behind public figures that we don't often see. Tomorrow, people from all over our city are going to be coming from North and South Baton Rouge to celebrate in various ways and honor the legacy of a man and the hope of this man and his vision that is far from being realized. Marshall Frady wrote a biography, a prolific, just beautiful work on Martin Luther King Jr. And he gave, of course, the usual stories that we often know, his speeches, his letters from jail, all of it, but even more, I find compelling the quiet moments of his life that can be captured from his journals and other reflections that people could give from experience of his words in real time outside of the public eye. And it talks a little bit about the experiences where he was experiencing full trauma, the trauma that changes our brain synapses, the kind of feelings of anxiety, of panic, even abandonment that often immobilizes us when we don't know where to escape from it. And we find ourselves hearing about his inner life when he was sitting in his kitchen recounting his own self-doubt and his dazed state of mind right after the Montgomery bus boycott, which really began the civil rights movement. He said, "Why did God see fit to catapult me into this place?" Sound familiar? Trying to think of a way that he could move out of the picture, the limelight, without appearing a coward, he turned to God at this kitchen table in this small chair, dropping his head in his hands, praying aloud in the midnight hush of his home. "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. But Lord, I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage, and I can't let the people see me like this," he prayed. "But I've come to the point where I can't face it alone anymore." And at that moment, as King would tell it to his friends, he seemed to hear the inner voice of Jesus answering him. "Martin Luther," as a faithful parent might say, "stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice, and stand for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of this world." That voice of Jesus promised never to leave me, Martin said. "No, never to leave me alone." Martin discovered, and we know in the pit of our gut, in our very bones, when we allow ourselves to remember that these are the places one has the closest encounters to the very heart of God. It is the place where our strength ends and God's begins as a foundation that we can step off from. And our breakdown can very well, if always, be God's breakthrough if we allow it to be. Todd Bolsinger talks about getting to that place in the forge of heating where the material seems like it's just about to melt and fall apart. Like just one more second, one more minute in this, and it's all gonna be gone. But somehow it holds firm. It's a little oozy, he says, and uncomfortable. But it's that moment where you and I have, if we take the metaphor to its proper place in our lives, it's that moment when we are about at our end, where we have the courage perhaps to look inside and see those hardened or sickened parts of ourselves that are present. John Dewey says, "We don't learn from experience, but we learn from reflecting on lived experience." Coming to that moment can be an unsettling part, in fact, the most unsettling part, so unbearable, most seldom try. It's that moment where each of us as people have a choice, either to turn up the heat and allow it to be at a level where we can stand by facing ourselves and our limitations with deep honesty, where self-awareness begins to grow. Or we can choose to stand just close enough to the forge to appear warm-ish, but too cool for transformation, even unchanged. And we know from the forging process of life that that is the most dangerous place to be. Light yourself on fire with passion, and people will come from miles to watch you burn. John Wesley, our founder of Methodism, said that, and I often thought it was the most awkward and kind of bad thing to say. I mean, I know we're talking about sharing the good news that we know, but as I think about it in this realm, when we're actually taking off the masks of self-sufficiency, when I even think personally about those places where I'm divesting myself of trying to be hardened to keep it all together and not accept the help that melting process can offer, maybe we can understand a little more of what he meant. It's not just something without, but it is a process within. And the greatest witness we can make to this world in burning for passion of God is to model first what healthy vulnerability with God and others actually looks like. To not lean into the failure of nerve and to have the courage, not being afraid to admit those things that we don't know when people are looking for answers. Maybe our greatest witness is when things go wrong, to resist the temptation to act or fix, but instead to listen more, searching for every single thing that we can learn for ourselves and others' benefit. Maybe we are called to have trust in God and to stay on that wilderness course, even when the luxuries of the past we crave aren't before us in the moment, or the promised land hasn't been reached at our expected and prescribed timeline. The heat of life is necessary. Our world isn't designed for it, but it's exactly what our world needs. So let our world be transformed, starting by you and me in the process, in the forge, trusting God along the way today. Amen.